Anthony, welcome to Validated.
Thank you for having me this morning, Austin. Appreciate it.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff you guys are up to. I want to kind of start off today with a bit of an overview of like what's happened in Wyoming historically to get it to be such a place that's interested in crypto, and then go into a bunch of the stablecoin news. But kind of to start us off, like I'd love to kind of get a grounding for how this project ended up on your desk.
That is a great question. And I think I can answer a couple of those in one time. So Wyoming has been really the foremost state when it comes to legislation about cryptocurrency, blockchain, digital assets. There's a lengthy history going back to 2016 when bills started getting put forward in the state legislature about those topics, what we call Web3 generally speaking. Since then, I think 80 bills have been put forward, almost 50 of them have passed, have been enacted, predominantly all of those under our current governor and the chairman of the Stable Token Commission, Mark Gordon. If you go back to why that started, there's two things we could point to. One is this is a oil and gas state, so there's always a desire to diversify revenues and income streams, and digital assets were tagged as a potential way to do that. And also this state cares a lot about your privacy, your property. So long before the Stable Token Act was drafted, there were already bills in place about protections of your private keys. Under First Amendment in the U.S., you cannot be compelled to give up your private keys in a civil or criminal proceeding. There's rights about, Bitcoin as property versus other kinds of assets. So that was kind of the state's initial foray into this, and it grew from there. I moved to Wyoming because I was working on a digital on-chain multimedia startup, predominantly around royalties and licenses for games, game assets, music, media, comics, whatever it was. If it was digital and a bunch of people worked on it, we'd created a platform that would essentially allow a person to pay for a piece of content with a native token or stablecoins, and that would allow routing to all of the different creators of that piece of content. And I moved my startup to Wyoming back in 2021 because of this very permissive legislative framework that they had created. Then the Stable Token Act passed. I was able to kind of be a fly on the wall for some of that in meetings of the Select Committee on Blockchain, which is the branch of the state legislature that oversees the program, as well as those of the Stable Token Commission, which certainly started up several months before I was brought on as the executive director. And when this program came live and they were looking for someone to run the day-to-day operations, they needed someone with a blend of not only blockchain and product development history and experience, but someone who had worked in banking and had understanding of securities law. And that was my career before I got into the digital asset space. I would argue that I got into the digital asset space because I was in the banking industry and saw some of the ineffectiveness, legacy technology, and bloat and tech debt, and just saw at that point it was just Bitcoin and Ethereum back in fall of 2015. But having a public version of something that looked like money on an immutable ledger that was globally transmissible, it just made a lot more sense than kind of legacy tech I was seeing. So that's how I ended up in this seat. I had that strange blend of experience they were looking for, and now I've been running the program since September of 2023.
Yeah, so you went from 5 years as a founder, and then it looks like a few years before that as a co-founder, to I think what people would generally consider to be the least high agency role in the world, which is working for a state government. You've gone from a place of like, it's a privately held corporation, you can do whatever you want. Obviously, you've got some corporate controls, but being a founder is probably like the highest degree of freedom and latitude you have as an operating role. I imagine working for a state government on something that is financial or financial adjacent is much lower. So like, what about this opportunity said, I want to give up all this agency and go work for a state government?
That is a great question. And I will note from the get-go that a lot of the hierarchy and bureaucracy that you'd think would be there in this role are there. That being said, we've been given a fair amount of what we call latitude from the commission. It's important to note that we're not a fly-by-night operation. We didn't have some magical hand-waving of this agency will be stood up and can do whatever it wants. We still go through the budgeting process. We still go through the recruiting process. We still go through the rulemaking process in the state. I'm sure we'll talk about some more of those along the way. So you do seed some of that, but at the same time, we've been very just able to move forward on this effort, and we've been able to move quite rapidly. I mean, getting this thing from zero to out the door, listed on exchanges in about 2.5 years is pretty much light speed for government. So it's been feasible, right? And I think but we haven't lost the transparency, which is a big part of this. So at this juncture, it's important to note that the commission itself is staffed by 7 commissioners, and the first 3 that were appointed by statute, i.e. the law in Wyoming, were the governor, Mark Gordon, our state treasurer, Kurt Meyer, and our state auditor, Christy Racines. And that was intended to really put the appropriate oversight on something that's never been done before. And when you look at the blend of commissioners we have as well, I mean, Joel Revel, someone who I think he's at Two Oceans Trust. I do believe that was the first Bitcoin trust in the U.S. Flavia Naves, former general counsel at Circle. David Pope, who's been on the blockchain task force for years, and Jeff Wallace, who's our kind of community bank liaison, because we want to make sure that this is technology that we're building for Wyoming's community banks and credit unions from a perspective, as well as retail and the big institutional cases. So we put the appropriate mix together, and that commission, as well as several other agencies, the Treasurer's Office and beyond, have been extremely supportive of making sure we get this thing out the door.
Yeah. So, one thing I think you're gonna find is a bit of a through line as we talk today is like, this is obviously a very exciting development. I think it's awesome to see states embracing this technology to the extent Wyoming has. At the same time, like, we have a federalist system here in the United States. And so one of the pieces that I think is quite interesting are when you guys look at like the perspective of the protections that a state brings. For example, you talked about how, no one can be compelled to turn over private keys. That may be true in state proceedings, but almost everything that involves any type of regulatory or financial action will in some point roll up to a federal case. Now, not exclusively, obviously, there's a lot of financial cases that are handled within a specific jurisdiction, but when you're talking about almost everything in crypto crosses a border, right? It's pretty easy to make anything that involves crypto an interstate commerce case. When you're kind of looking at it from that perspective, what do you see? And I also recognize you're not a lawyer, but like when you're looking at it from that perspective, what do you see as like the additional value that's brought by having these protections at a state level when they're not yet implemented at a federal level? So
one of the things I would point to in that regard was how we've structured our rules in our terms of service or user agreement, where the Frontier stable token, which is our first Wyoming stable token, because there may be many, and we'll get to that in a bit, we're available for any lawful purpose. So one of the things we did along the way as we were putting together all of the legislative and legal backing for this was look at the terms of service for USDC or for PYUSD. And if you looked at Circle, for example, they've got a whole litany of restricted activities, prohibited transfers, and some of those are overtly illicit activity, right? And we don't want to invite that. We have protections about that. They'll talk about in a second. But there was also restrictions on you can't buy prescription medicine with USDC.
Yep.
You can't gamble with USDC, which I think will have an impact on how prediction markets are structured. You can't buy firearms with USDC. And
all of which are legal activihities to do with the currency.
Exactly. So we took a look at all of that, and in my testimony in May to the Select Committee on Blockchain, I highlighted that and said, we're putting together our user agreement. We just want to share some of these findings with you. And we ended up receiving a letter from that Select Committee encouraging us to make sure that Wyoming stable tokens were available for any lawful purpose. And then that is what manifested in our rules, and that is what manifested in our user agreement. So we did have to highlight, to your point, Austin, that does include the federal purview. It includes what we have in Wyoming or whatever jurisdiction you happen to be in, right? So there's kind of that hierarchy there as well. But that was something we definitely flagged along the way. And I will note that I think in maybe August, September, maybe a bit more recently than that, the days do kind of blend together after a while, Circle did now make an edit to their terms where they have said you can now purchase firearms with USDC. And apparently that came out of the blue, but we'd been talking about it for 4 to 6 months at that point, so it wasn't too surprising for us to see some changes like that. But that was an important one, and I think I'll take it just one step further. I'm not getting into the specifics here, and this is where I will couch that everything is. This is my opinions, and this is Anthony's story, not those of the commission. But when we were talking to a number of issuers, exchanges, and even regulatory bodies along the way, there was some conversation around the interdiction piece and freezes on accounts that were done kind of customarily while subpoenas were sought. And if you were to take that perspective and apply it to what we're building here in Wyoming, if someone was to come to Anthony and say, freeze front tokens at this account, I have to say, go get a warrant or some kind of legal document and bring it to me so I can do that. We're not really able, and again, this goes back to our rules and our user agreement, we're not able to perform interdiction without that kind of legal backing. And we certainly can't perform a freeze without an explicit directive to do so from a regulatory body that has some amount of oversight over us, which again would go back to the federal purview. We thought that was important because if we were to go across that line and start doing freeze and seize unilaterally, that starts to look a lot like a constitutional problem under the Fourth Amendment, where we're seizing people's assets without a valid reason to do so. So we wanted to make sure that was respected in our rules and our terms as well.
Yeah, I know, so again, I know you're not a lawyer, but Delaware famously has Chancery Court, right? There are these structures that certain states have put in place to serve certain specific business needs. I think Texas also now has a specific business court system, which separates certain types of cases outside of the typical purview. Do you guys have something similar in the works around, I think about a situation where a DeFi hack happens and suddenly there's a bunch of stable coins that by no fault of your own are now in the possession of North Korea. That flow of funds and the timeliness necessary to stop those from becoming functionally untraceable through mixers or something like that, it can be measured in hours, not days. And so do you guys have things in place to allow for I guess I would say more responsive systems than a typical court process might take?
Yes, and I will note that we do have a Chancery Court in Wyoming that has been stood up around these specific topics. I think it's couched kind of in business law, but I do believe that Chancery Court has now been built out. I think it was staffed by, and again, this is something that existed before. It was established before I took this role. I think it was maybe staffed by one judge. Now they're building out to 3. So as these nuanced digital asset cases come in, we are building that corpus of not only tacit knowledge, but also just the case law, as you will.
Yeah.
In terms of responsiveness, one of the things we're working on with several of our partners is, and again, I'll keep this at a high level because I'm not sure these programs have rolled out publicly yet, but behind the scenes, there are a number of both domestic and international exchanges, analytics firms that are now working to create networks of law enforcement agencies. So if we do have a high probability that something may be malicious that we've detected first, that we don't have any inbound, subpoenas, TROs, warrants, what have you, then we can run that by these agencies or run it. They can run it up on their side and say, well, under this jurisdiction, this would be malicious or illicit activity, and we could take action then. So that's one of the things we're doing quite proactively, because if this thing scales into a global product, which is our intent, we're going to need that international network and kind of the backing of all of that. We need, we have redundancies on our side of how we can handle that inbound. But yeah, that's stuff that we're all working on actively.
Yeah, so I find just my bias here is the nitty gritty details of how something like this occurs are fascinating to me. So I'm gonna throw another constitutional question at you. Article 1, Section 10. No state shall issue a currency, money, emit bills, establish a national currency or a local currency. Stablecoins, obviously, they're US dollars under the hood, but they kind of fall into this strange regulatory structure where they're not necessarily considered the same as cash, and they are slightly considered a currency. Now, you can make a lot of arguments about how AWS web credits and, things like that could technically be considered a currency at some point. How how did you guys think about that regulatory positioning of, obviously, if Wyoming decides to issue a national or a state currency, that runs you into a bunch of legal issues. Where does a stablecoin fall in your guys' view?
So from our perspective, we've worked hard to avoid that concern. Even just the semantic level. I mean, the token versus coin piece is part of that. We don't want to mint coin per the Constitution.
Yep.
Although I will note it's a bit more nuanced than that on our side. The way that the Select Committee has put the vernacular forth is a token is something that is backed by an asset. A coin is something with intrinsic value. So cryptocurrency would be a coin. Stablecoins in other ways would be tokens, which is difficult because the industry has picked up stablecoin as the parlance for what we would consider a token.
Right. So you might say that, for example, there's no reason you ever do this, but if you were going to say, we're going to issue a wrapped version of Bitcoin, the same way Coinbase has like a CB BTC product, if there was a Wyoming BTC product, that may fall into a different regulatory category because that would be closer to issuing a currency.
Yes, and again, I'll not yes to the currency piece. I will let the lawyers determine that. But I do think that creating something out of nothing that intrinsic value puts you closer to a currency than a backed asset. It's a difficult conversation for me because from where I'm standing, we're backing Wyoming stable tokens with U.S. dollars. So how are we creating a currency that contravenes the dollar? Just that basic structure of permitted investments to me breaks the whole argument. So that's
yeah. Although you think about there's a lot of Caribbean nations that have a currency which is functionally just a wrapper for U.S. dollars sitting in their central bank.
Well, are those Caribbean nations under the U.S. Constitution?
No, right. But this is the interesting component, of course, because they're considered foreign currencies despite being
pegged or wrapped. Right.
Yeah, they're effectively the difference between a state issued token and the Bermudan dollar, which I believe is 1-to-1 backed, is an interesting question.
Right. Well, again, that is a currency that's issued by a government, right, with TPD backing to it. With the stable token, again, we have a basket of permitted investments. It's cash and a conservative blend of short duration U.S. Treasuries, even shorter duration repurchases thereof. So that is one part. But one other piece I would also note is in our user agreement terms of service, one of the things we say explicitly there is no one can be forced to accept a Wyoming stable token. And if you think about, you go to these coffee shops, they have to accept U.S. dollars,
cash
U.S.
and
currency.
Stamps.
Exactly. We've been very clear that that's not our expectation. That's not what we're doing. Because once you start forcing that issue, then I think you've really stepped into the muck and mire on the currency issue.
Yeah. There's kind of two things I want to keep pushing at, and then we'll get into some of the more fun stuff. But your neighbor to the north has legalized cannabis, which is a substance that at the state level.
South. Colorado?
Oh, I was talking about Montana.
To the south. Oh, okay, yeah.
But yes, you a citizen can go in and they can purchase a cannabis product, which is not allowed under federal law, but is allowed under state law. You mentioned this sort of idea of all allowable legal uses. From where does that definition derive? Is it based on state law or is federal law, and how would the hypothetical where, of course, cannabis is not legal in Wyoming, but if it were to pass through a ballot measure or some other type of measure, how would the Stablecoin Commission, I'm not going to ask you which way you'd rule, but what would you consider in looking at if that should be allowable under the terms of service?
Right. So we have defined that, and I do believe this is in our token management rules because that's where we talk about the interdiction piece of it. We do define any lawful purpose. If it's not in the token rules, then it's definitely in the user agreement. But we have that cascade, right? It's any lawful purpose under what's lawful. Well, it's federal law, Wyoming law, your jurisdiction, in kind of that hierarchy. So there will certainly be some questions around that, right? When things get push comes to shove. But I do think, and I will say this generally speaking, I do think there are unbanked or underbanked industries, and I would hope that we'd be able to solve problems for some of them. Maybe not all of them, but at least a few of them.
Yeah, this gets so interesting to me because Wyoming also does not have any dry counties. I'm not sure about if there's specific smaller jurisdictions where it might be. But it's interesting that you include sort of all applicable potential definitions of lawful in there. From a logistics standpoint, how does that work? Are these rules that are getting written down at some sort of like program level, or are they just sort of terms of service, and then it's up to whatever payment processor? Like in a hypothetical dry community, I'm sure there's not a liquor store there anyway, but if there were, how is that being enforced, or is it just a terms of service ex post facto enforcement?
On the last question, more towards the latter, but one thing I want to revert back to is how that you kind of touched on the distribution point. So I think it's a good section to talk a little bit more about that. So we as the commission, which is 5 people in the agency who report to 7 commissioners, and I ran it for a year solo, so there was a year where I had 7, it was one of me and 7 bosses. But again, they've all been very accommodating, so no complaints there. We don't have the capacity to do direct sale of tokens from the commission to an individual at the retail level, because to do KYC or AML on 1 million people isn't going to scale for a 5-person team, even if we're all working on it. So what we've done is adopted a model similar to what Circle has with Coinbase, kind of that reseller model. We call them licensed service providers, right? So we have to do our KYB, or our know your business checks, on a counterparty. They do reciprocal due diligence on us, which is a little easier because we're a state. No real, no beneficial owner or anything like that.
Right.
And then provided we can get confidence on their compliance framework and footprint, we can onboard them as a licensed service provider and then open up those rails. And I'll say that at a high level because we're on Kraken, obviously with Solana. We have Cumberland as a market maker and liquidity provider. But those LSPs can be anyone. It could be community banks. It could be credit unions, payment platforms, many others along the way. So it's a pretty robust slate that we can coordinate with, and I imagine states and NGOs will be there as well at some point. But there's a bit of reliance on them until this thing proves to be revenue positive. If we start making some real returns, the question is how much can the agency keep to maybe expand a compliance team to do that direct issuance, which I would like to see in the next, let's say, 2 years, because it'd be more direct, less fees involved in everything, and you go from there. And then another question that you put in there was around the rules and how we're kind of arbitrating all of that. And this is another good time to jump in and say, this is all something that's gone through a public vetting process. This is not something that Anthony can draft a policy or rules and say, okay, this is how it works now, and big green check mark, and we just ride off into the sunset. The ultimate law that we have to follow is state statute, right? So that's put together by the state legislature, informed by the Select Committee on Blockchain. They typically run the bills, legislature votes on it. So this is the long-tailed intent of the full state, right? In statute, we are able, as an agency, to do rule setting. So when it gets to that interpretation of how do you go from statute at a high level, that's meant not to be open to interpretation necessarily, but to allow the agency to operate. We then put the rules in place, and we have rules in place on our procurement process, reserves management, token management. And again, these are things that had to be drafted, approved by the commission, go through a 45-day public notice and comment period, address those comments in front of the commission, say, do we want to change things, yes or no, then promulgate them through the Secretary of State's office, the Legislative Services Office, reviewed by Management Council, ultimately approved by the governor. Now you have rules in place. And rules are not law, but they have the same kind of effect as the law. So that's how we've built out this whole framework. And then policies, procedures, like our terms of service, user agreement, risk disclosures, that's all kind of downstream of that. But again, you're seeing these kind of hierarchies and these cascades all along the way. And again, these are all things that have gone through a public process to put them forth. So this is not something that, and this is why this took 2.5 years to get out the door. And this is also why when other states have now started to get interested in this topic, interested in what we're building, our position to them is, well, we've put the work in over 2.5 years on the specifics, took 2 to 3 years of legislative intent to get to the Stable Token Act, generally speaking. Why start from scratch? I mean, obviously there's going to be some differences for every state in the nuance of their own statute and how it could fit into a program there, but wouldn't it be easier for us to just issue a Wyoming stable token with our statute, rules, policies, procedures, vendors, tech stack, distribution mechanisms for your state, on our suite. So it kind of starts looking like almost like a white label or a SaaS platform issued by a state on behalf of other states.
Right. So this is kind of like an interesting development, because there's only a few of these type of structures I can think of in state governments where the state has something that is not just a regulatory framework, but an operating framework, which is also income generating, right? Famously, right now, it is quite hard to pass on yield for any type of stablecoin product. I believe the stablecoin issued here does not have a yield bearing component to it. And we're sitting in like a 4% T-bill environment. Like, this is actually like a revenue channel for somebody at the end of the day. How does that sort of, I know the numbers aren't huge at the moment, but there is revenue coming off of these basket of investment portfolios that you discussed, whether it's local bonds or, T-bills or something along those lines. How is that handled at the moment, and what is the thinking along that? Is that sort of similar to a lottery system where it gets just plowed into the general budget of the state, or how is the commission thinking about this?
Again, great question to touch on. There's be a couple things that we go through here. Let's start with kind of the backing and the flow now, and then we get into the yield question, because I think that's an important one for the fairly near future, especially with everything going on in Capitol Hill right now. So again, in statute, there is a very explicit cascade. So we get dollars in for the purchase of stable tokens. We sell those stable tokens out. Those dollars get sent to our custodian, which is Fiduciary Trust, which is under Franklin Templeton. Another branch of Franklin Templeton, which is Franklin Advisors, actually manages the funds. That's how they say we're going to buy these T-bills, these repos, et cetera. And to your point, those are interest bearing. Those interest dollars come back to the state. And I put air quotes in that for a second because there's a couple of carve-outs here. In statute, we have what's called the trust account, which is where we do the full backing of the token one-to-one for the benefit of token holders, not the commission's money, not Wyoming's money, kind of that off-balance sheet kind of item. Once interest starts coming in to that pot, well, we're now above that one-to-one backing, right? So what we did in our rulemaking, because this was not specific in statute, was create what we call the liquidity fund account, where we capture that interest income that's being generated off those bonds. And that's relevant because we also have a statutory obligation to over-collateralize the token by 2% before we return any funds to the state. So we've got the one-to-one backing, over-collateralization. Now funds can be distributed back to the agency writ large. That's meant to pay down our own obligations. This is meant to be a net zero program for the state. We have an obligation to pay back the general fund, which gave us the dollars to get this program off the ground. That's one of the things that will be done first. And I will note, because I take great pride in this, of the about $6 million we've been allocated, we've spent less than $2.5 million to get this thing done, which again, government efficiency, right?
Yep.
So we pay back our obligation, pay for the go-forward obligations for a given biennium, which is how we do our budget. It's every 2 years. And then once that's done on a quarterly basis, the remainder is intended to be swept into the state's school foundation program, right? So it doesn't sit in that general fund pot. There is an explicit purpose for those dollars at the end of the day. Again, all in statute. Now let's talk about some of the nuance and the yield question. So in terms of yield, obviously there's a prohibition in the Genius Act for permitted payment stablecoin issuers from distributing yield. My position, we're not under the Genius Act. If you look at Section 2, Definition 24, who those issuers are, they're defined as persons, right? Individuals, banks, fintechs, trusts, and other business entities. Nowhere in there does it say state issuers have to abide by the same framework.
Very interesting loophole.
Because if you think about it, and the way the Genius Act works is you can be under a state supervision until you get to $10 billion, and then you have to go to the federal framework and convert to a bank or trust kind of structure. We're a state. We're not doing this as a bank or an issuer. It's just the state itself. It's a sovereign entity. So I view us as outside of that scope. And then in terms of the yield question, states do have some exemptions to securities law. That's how things like muni bonds work, right? So that's one of the things we've been investigating. I said in my testimony to the commission, again, all of our meetings are public on a monthly basis. This is a November discussion. As we started looking into this, I flagged that there's really there's three competitions to be had about yield. One is, as a state under a federal securities framework, How do we operate this? What does that look like? What are the exemptions that are available to us? Then once we figure that out, we just say, okay, well, at the state level, there's also maybe restrictions. They're not going to be explicit for stablecoins, obviously, because the state framers are just coming together now. But Wyoming has pretty strict limits about the amount of debt it's able to take on, the ability to distribute state dollars to people which functionally should be going back to the taxpayer, to others who are maybe not taxpayers, or even if they are taxpayers, you don't want to play favorites there. So there's a lot of state considerations as well. And then whatever happens between those two sides, the technology needs to support it. So that's another question. And the final piece of it is really the finance side, which I think will be perhaps the trickiest. And this is where this conversation needs to consider all three of these pillars as we go through the discussion, which is, if we wanted to create a yield-bearing product that was straight APY, from my perspective, that doesn't really work, because in terms of the timing of the payments, we would not really be able to commit to, we're going to give you, we're taking in 4% off the bonds, over collateralizing to, we're going to pass on 1%. That's going to be hard for us to do because we don't know at what point in the next year we're going to be over collateralized, right? Perhaps we're behind that 2% mark as we build up the cachet, but then there's a big redemption and now we're at 104. Do we immediately hit a button to distribute yield? I don't know. So there's going to be these timing differences. And then you also need to consider the pay down of the agency obligation. You need to consider that some amount of funding is going to need to be returned to the school foundation fund before we should start sending money out of the state. Now, what is that magic point where we say we've returned enough to the state, this program will be 10x more successful if we turn on yield, which will, even if we give away some portion of that, we're still ultimately returning more to the state. That's a big TBD for us. So
there's also some other interesting opportunities there, which are, of course, lending to municipal governments at below the market rate, which is not returning funds to the local, to a fund, but is like, it's the same thing. I don't know. Municipal bonds tend to trade significantly higher than T-bills because they lack the backing that a T-bill does. And they're often not bailed out by the states, but that's an interesting component too of I guess what I'm getting at here is this is very different than a state typically operates anything regarding finance on, because which is very exciting, but we're also in an era where we're flirting with a sovereign wealth fund again. There's a lot of these other types of things that are happening on the macro level that are just things that have not historically been in consideration. Wyoming also not the bluest state in the union. I think that's a fair statement to say. This is in some level an expansion of what government is doing relative to what it has historically done. So I'm curious, what are the politics of this in the state? Is this just your typical state finance operation? It hasn't really gotten much controversy behind it, or is this an issue that is bipartisan? Is this primarily supported by one branch? I think the nice thing about crypto is depending on which angle you look at the problem, you can plot it on almost any side of the political axis, depending on what you care about at a given moment.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think we're kind of operating on the tail end of horseshoe theory with this one.
Yeah.
Right. So Wyoming is obviously a very conservative state. Out of 92 state legislators, I believe 5 of them are officially Democrats. But a number of those Democrats have been the ones pushing this program forward. So Senator Chris Rothfuss has really been behind the plurality of the blockchain legislation in the state. He's the co-chair of the Select Committee. On that Select Committee, we also have Mike Yin, who's a representative Democrat as well. On the Joint Appropriations Committee, we've had support from Mike Guru on the Senate side. But if you were to take some of those Democrats and their position on, let's say, the right to transact and privacy, they would map right on to what those on the right and the Republican side are saying. So I do think there's interest, there's some overlap between those two. Obviously, people want the state to be solvent. People want the state to diversify its income streams. That's not really a political issue. That's just as a boilerplate statement. You could say, well, we want to make money. We want to develop business here. We want to retain our talent. We want to create industry. We want to create jobs. And if having more and more digital asset infrastructure facilitates that, fantastic. What it
Sure.
does, you did touch on, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I would just say though that like I think if the state proposed like we are going to have a Wyoming owned auto factory and like start building Fords or something like that, there'd be some pushback under like, well, this just isn't what we typically ask the government to do in a conservative environment.
Right. So the example that's often given in those kind of conversations is like the state of Wyoming is not going to start a brick building company.
Right.
Right.
Or a logging company, right? Instead, what they do is they have a whole regulatory framework where they say, we're going to sell timber rights, we're going to sell mineral rights. It's a licensing regime, not an operating regime. And I guess that's what I think is so interesting is most states, when they're dealing with anything crypto related, it's a licensing regime, it's an oversight regime, it's not an operating company. And effectively, you guys now have an operating company within a state apparatus. And again, the closest analogy I can find is like a state lottery. Which is something that is both an operating company within a state, and generates revenue. So I think this is fascinating because, from this perspective, it's one of the few expansions of most state operations are obviously losing money, right? That the administering your park service costs money. You may charge people for access to certain types of things, but like it loses money every year, right? Because that's like on its own accounting basis. But this obviously has the potential to make a very high amount of money for the state if it catches on.
Yeah, so a couple of things in response to that. Just in terms of, again, the split of oversight versus deployment and operationalizing activity, I think that's going to get very interesting with the Genius Act because now there's an expectation that states are going to create their own frameworks to govern stablecoins issued within the confines of their state. So, but we're doing the actual issuance, right? So,
right. But now, in some ways, it's even stranger because you're going out and you're pitching California on, hey, issue your stablecoin through not only just our legal framework but potentially our operating framework. This all gets me very excited, but it's a very interesting departure from the way this has been done anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, and that's why I feel very fortunate to be at the forefront of it. So, again, just to wrap up that thought, on the Genius Act, right, you're going to have the state frameworks for stablecoins issued by private entities in their state, but that may not govern a publicly issued stablecoin, which is going to be this kind of delta. Secondly, on the state-by-state piece, right, I will say they're typically coming to us at this point. We don't have a list of, like, here's people to reach out to in, like, every state. They see what we're doing. They've seen some of the demonstrations we've done that could bring efficiency, cost savings to their constituents. They're interested in that. And going back and kind of dovetailing off that, come back to the original question around, why the state has created a facility to do this versus, an auto repair shop under the state of Wyoming. There are a lot of sovereign benefits that are conferred by doing this issuance as a state agency. We've already talked about the lawful purpose and being open there rather than being at the behest of banking infrastructure. Yeah. The cross-border piece to me is important because we're a sovereign entity in the United States. We can go across border. I don't mean to sound harsh on this, but what the EU wants to do with the MiCA framework may regulate exchanges that a frontier stable token might be on, absolutely, but they're not going to be able to tell us what to do, right? We're a U.S. sovereignty. We report to the federal government, and again, from my perspective, the Genius Act is silent on the issuance. So it's going to be, and that's why it's so important that we've taken the time to go through this public promulgation process for all of our rules, for all the policies, because we're creating our own oversight framework for ourselves. And the last thing I'll note is, one of the questions we get a lot is what happens if this becomes massively successful and next thing you know, 50 states all want their own stable token. That's one of the reasons why we've been having the dialogue with different states to say, okay, if you don't want, we're not going to push ours, we're saying it's available if you want it. But if you do go ahead and want to create your own, you need to prioritize interoperability from a technology perspective and a legal framework perspective, or else it's going to get very messy very quickly, and I fully agree with that point. So we're trying to be on the tip of the spear with all of this and make sure that other states understand what's gone into this, because you don't want this to become a race of, well, who has like the least regulation, right? And that's not where you want to be with this kind of issuance.
And so, I mean, You're a former founder. At the risk of getting you into trouble, like, why is there not like a 10-person marketing team going out and trying to sell this to every other state? And where is the line for you between running this like a, like, I live in New York City. The MTA here, which runs the subway, they're not like advertising to people like, "Hey, we can go run your subway." Now, there's a few reasons maybe they're not advertising that, but you go over to France and like the French companies that run the high speed rail, like they do go out and pitch, Morocco and Algeria and California and whatever on like, "Hey, we'll build the high speed rail system for you." Like, in your mind, is there a line there that's just like, we wouldn't do this because of some state apparatus component, or just we haven't gotten to a place yet where we're ready to go hire like a B2G marketing team and go out and, pitch Nevada on issuing a stable coin?
Well, I will first respond and say, as a former New Yorker, which is where I spent most of my life before, again, moving to Wyoming in 2021, because of the legislative framework, and as a avid daily rider of the 6 train, which runs 60% on time, I would personally state that I am for the privatization of some of these things that would make them perhaps run more efficiently if you gave users choice. I've spent time in Japan doing martial arts training over the years, and you travel on the Shinkansen or their just public rail, or privatized rail, and it's just a night and day difference from what you see in our big cities. So that is certainly something. But the line for me really comes down to the fact that this is a government-sponsored program. This is run at the behest of the Wyoming taxpayer. And again, I pride ourselves on the fact that we haven't scaled this thing up to be, a 15-person team. And I do think we'll need to get there at some point, right? We're going to need to keep building out tech, interoperability, other components here, but that needs to be downstream of proving that this program can provide revenues first, break even with our obligation to the state, and then have more autonomy and authority to run based on our own income provided, while still, again, making sure there's enough for the school foundation fund. If it gets bigger than that, then what can we fund in the state beyond that? And one thing I'll note on that front is, pun not intended, if you look at Tether, and I'm not advocating that we're going to do everything that Tether's going to do. We're not buying gold bullion. We're not investing in Bitcoin. We're not investing in startups. But in 2024, I believe Tether's profits were about $13 billion across 125 people. And that would probably make it the most profitable company in human history on a per employee basis.
Yes, it is.
If this pie, which is now about $300 billion of stablecoins in circulation, grows to those projections from Citigroup, where it's $3.7 trillion, $4 trillion by 2030, and that has been put forth by our U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent as well. If that pie grows and we could be where Tether is now as a state, as the entire everything else grows and scales, you're talking about paying for a material portion of Wyoming's budget, because Wyoming's budget every 2 years is $11 billion. So again, our 2-year budget is less than the dollars Tether made after expenses in 2024.
Yeah, so one of the pieces I think is really interesting about this is like, so the go-to-market side of this, which I do want to get into here as well. Circle, famously, the company that makes the most off of USDC is not Circle, but Coinbase, because the yield structure agreements, at least in the short term, are such that Coinbase gets the majority of the yield. Crypto exchanges are the same as any company. They're self-interested actors that are not going to, out of the goodness of their heart, say, we like Wyoming, we want to support the stablecoin. I'm sure there's commercial agreements under the hood with everyone here. Broad level, how do you think about go-to-market? And, when someone like Kraken is engaging with you, like what does the broad basis of commercial agreement look like for something like that?
Sure. So once again, a couple of nuances here, right? We talked about the licensed service providers before, our LSPs. Expectation is we'll have commercials in those agreements because they're distributing the tokens on our behalf. We treat this kind of like a revenue share type of model, right? And if they want to impose fees on their end users in either direction, purchases, withdrawals, that's their prerogative. We don't dictate anything about that. Kraken is interesting because Kraken doesn't maintain a treasury. That's what we got Cumberland on board for. So we created a whole different policy about listing exchanges, where we have direct listing exchanges that go through our direct KYB. We have government regulated listing exchanges that say these are exchanges that are overseen by some kind of federal apparatus, and we could check the compliance framework there, their MTLs, their public filings for the Coinbases of the world, let's say. And then there's the indirect listing exchanges, which is more about the DEX side of things, because we know these tokens will travel and they'll be on Uniswap. They're already on Uniswap. Those are not things, as decentralized platforms, we're really able to arbitrate or get KYB documentation on.
Right.
So that's something we would overtly not promote, but we'd use kind of as an internal tracking mechanism to say, here's what the token's circulating. So again, there's more nuance behind that as well as we scale this thing and look to those companies. But in terms of the go-to-market, one kind of key thing that I've been talking about frequently is we're not trying to, as a public entity, compete with private interest, right? I'm not calling up Circle's clients, I'm not calling up Tether's clients and saying, how could Wyoming serve you better? What we're looking to do is open some of those new doors. And again, going back to the idea of collaborating with other states. Every state is going to have like an unclaimed property team for the most part. Well, if those claimants have $25 in their, that's their money, they should go get it. Well, if it's a $10 ACH fee from that treasurer's office, then your bank's going to impose a fee. And if you got to go across border and do a fiat translation there, that's more fees. Well, what if we could just give it to you in stable tokens where our fees are 0.00001 cents? Right. So there's that kind of development, and that would be a whole new section of that pie that's going to grow. That would work for state to federal payments. That may work for putting a dollar equivalent in pension funds if we do unlock a yield-bearing version of this. But I think most exciting is a lot of the conversations we've had with NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We've talked some of the politics before, but you're likely aware that agencies like USAID have been kind of shuttered or defunded because they were not able to see where all these dollars were going in real time. Yep. And we're seeing some of that in specific states. We won't get into that. But the ability to have that oversight for aid distribution and maybe even program aid distribution into a platform at the state level, I think is a big, big piece of the pie that everyone's missing, especially where we're a sovereign entity that has the ability to go cross-border and keep the dollar strong globally while also reducing fraud is something that we can offer. And I think that's probably the biggest piece of the pie that everyone's missing.
The thing you mentioned earlier about, like maybe New York City should look at privatizing some more of its infrastructure. It's very interesting because I would imagine that the default position would be very similar on what you're doing, because you can say you're not competing with Circle, but at the end of the day, you are competing with Circle. Now, you may be competing with Circle in a little bit of a different area, but like Montana and Wyoming compete for jobs, they compete for industry, they compete for tourism, right? There's competition, even if what you have to offer is quite different between the two different locations. And so I guess if you've already made this jump into saying the state is comfortable being an operator in this area, I would say that one of the reasons that government-run quasi-corporations, whether it's the post office or whether it's Amtrak or whether it's the MTA, have trouble is that they actually operate in this sort of uncanny valley between a subsidized public good and a competitive corporate enterprise. And so do you think, again, just your sort of personal opinion here, that like, assuming this thing is successful and starts getting much larger and you have the resourcing to do so, like, is there any reason you would not want to compete with some of these other groups, or, start offering direct services to individuals where I can come in and, I mean, every taxpayer in the state has effectively already passed KYC with you, right? And so there's a lot of those type of components too, where like maybe it's a citizen benefit, whereas as a resident of Wyoming, like, you can access this stuff directly. Like, what do you think the future of that looks like? And is there a place you kind of draw the line and say, like, the state probably doesn't have appetite past this certain point?
Yeah, I think, just to answer the last question directly, there's not a magic number around this, but if it gets to the point where we're directly competing with Circle or Tether for clients, I think we've gone the wrong direction. And that goes back to your question around, what is the role of government? And I don't think there's an appetite to compete with private business. That being said, I will also acknowledge the gray area you highlighted, which is just yesterday, Circle and Coinbase announced that they're going to be doing significant work in Bermuda to put the nation on chain. right, with stablecoins that Circle's already working in that jurisdiction, giving everyone a Coinbase wallet. We'll see how that implementation goes. Those are both extremely capable teams that I know have been working on that for quite some time. So I'm very candidly excited to see how that goes, because maybe we can take a look at that model and see how that works to give every citizen in Wyoming a wallet. But then we get into our side of the house where it's, well, where's the PII going? How do we do this in a way that, again, cuts down on fraud, which may be an easier piece of it, but like if we're going to start doing KYC and everybody, what are we collecting about every citizen in Wyoming? Those questions start to get a little dicier for us.
Sure.
So I'm very interested to see how they roll that out and what happens in Bermuda. And we've had a great dialogue with the team in Bermuda and Bermuda along the way as well. So kudos to them on all of that. But in terms of the competition question, I think there's just so many different use cases and so many that haven't really been brought forward by stablecoins yet, despite the proliferation, despite how well they're doing. To go from 300 billion to 3+ trillion, you need to 10x that pie. And I think that, as I just highlighted, there's a number of ways for us to help do so materially with global remittances, cross-border settlement. One of the things I'm quite excited about is potential liquidity pools for different fiat currencies that may be state or nation state sponsored. I spent a little bit of time.
Sure, you can spin up an FX trading division.
Why not? I mean,
yeah.
What is Uniswap besides an FX pool, right? It's not technically difficult. I do think there's some oversight questions there, and that'd be a whole, to your point, that would be a new thing for us to tack on to all this. It needs to be done in an intelligent way. But what I will say, and I've communicated this in the public forum as well, when I was over in South Korea for a Korea Blockchain Week, went to Japan afterwards, speaking with some of the regulatory bodies there. They have a lot of concern around U.S. dollar dominance in this rapidly growing stablecoin sector, and to a certain extent, rightfully so, because it's 99+% U.S. dollars in that pool. But I do think, and I highlighted this to them, I do think there are ways to be collaborative in that regard with things like liquidity pools, where perhaps the USD side of that is a frontier stable token, and then Japan's CBDC, public-private partnership, public entity issuing a stable token, which when we showed up and they didn't know we were working on all this, that's become a third option for them that they didn't know existed. So they're all looking into that now as they revise their rules in Japan or they draft the rules in South Korea. Just creating these nation-state sponsored liquidity pools where I could deposit US dollars with the frontier stable token and withdraw a stable yen or a stable won whenever I want to, whether that's because I'm traveling there and that's easier for me, or because we want to cut down on FX arbitrage with real-time price discovery and deep liquidity, that would create, again, real-time pricing, prevent people from shorting the system, which has perhaps a very lucrative effect for the investors doing so. Kind of sucks for the people whose currency is the one being shorted.
Yep. It's kind of like, as you sort of describe a lot of these components, like it's a very interesting thing that Wyoming's been able to pull this off, right? And so there's a lot of states with a lot larger budgets. There's a lot of states with a much larger and more sophisticated, let's call it homegrown tech apparatus, whether that's California or New York. What about Wyoming do you think made this be possible there? And but both from sort of a conceptual side and an execution side. There's a lot of states I have to imagine who have thought about this, but you're the first to do it.
And this is the paradox, right? Which is, I believe we were able to pull this off because we are a very small and very agile state, but one that also cares a lot about small government, right? So we're kind of expanding, but we're doing so within the confines of an agile government that's able to maintain this oversight with the commission. So both of those things exist simultaneously. But again, I would go back to just the desire for revenue diversification, right?
Certainly.
Oil and gas is not perhaps going to be around forever, probably beyond my lifetime, my grandchildren's lifetime, but it is a finite resource. So what else can bring dollars into this state? And if you have an agile government to work on these things, which can be done as stablecoins proliferate, if you have intelligent people working on this, and again, looking at some of the co-chairs of the select committee that have overseen us, Senator Chris Rothfuss is a former nuclear physicist, right? So there's a lot of intelligence going into all of this, and again, there's great diversity of thought about how it should be deployed. We have all those conversations, and it's led to some very interesting dialogue. But I think we've developed a stronger program because of that, and that's where we've netted out.
Awesome. Well, Anthony, thank you for joining us today on Validated. And give people, before we close out, some information. If they're interested in this initiative, either from using it, reading more about it, becoming licensed to issue it like you talked about, where can folks find out more?
Sure. So every document we've ever put forth is on stabletoken.wyo.gov. We have a 2-page brief if you want the high level. We've got a full fact book if you want to understand more about how we've gotten to where we're going. We've got a licensed service provider onboarding process that is linked in there. So if you're interested, there's a KYB intake to fill out. We've automated as much of this as possible, right? 5-person team. We're relying on Notion forms quite a bit here. The Frontier stable token, which is the first Wyoming stable token to be issued, was launched on Solana and Kraken. They made available through Kraken on the 7th. I will note we have focused on interoperability. We did have a mandate from the select committee to be multi-chain and tech agnostic. So through our procurement process by onboarding Layer 0 and Fireblocks, our token is interoperable on Avalanche, Arbitrum, Base, Ethereum, Optimism, and Polygon as well as Solana, and that bridging is available through Stargate. So we look forward to scaling this program throughout 2026 and going from there.
Awesome. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the time, Austin.
Thanks.